Good morning, media and popular culture people, and welcome to the second video for our online class. Today we're going to be discussing some more theoretical foundations. Specifically, we'll be looking at Plato and Adorno and Horkheimer. So to dig in, the first thing that I asked you to read was Plato's Allegory of the Cave. So this was written in about 356, 357 BC, somewhere in there. And it was written by Plato, and it is a imagined dialogue between Socrates and Glaucon. So Socrates was Plato's teacher, his mentor, and Glaucon was Plato's brother. And the idea here was that they were having a discussion about a theoretical scenario in which we have some prisoners who are kept in a cave. They're bound up in such a way so that they can only see the cave wall. And what they see on the cave wall are shadows that are cast by a fire and the guards behind them that hold up various shapes to create shadows on the wall. The notion here is that because these prisoners have spent their entire lives in this cave, that what they see on the wall they mistake for reality because it's all they've ever seen. And so what Plato is doing here is he's having Socrates make a point about reality and about what we can see and about mediated perception. And this idea that we can go through life thinking that what we encounter is reality when in fact it really isn't. And so of course, this has certain parallels with contemporary media, which we'll talk about in just a minute. So the story goes, of course, that the prisoners are chained up. They see these shadows. They accept the shadows as reality, but one of the prisoners escapes. And he runs outside the cave. And he sees the world. And in doing so, this, of course, is a painful experience. The light blinds his eyes at first. He's very intimidated. He's scared by everything that he sees. But after a few moments, he begins to adjust. And as he begins to adjust, he becomes more and more excited seeing all this world around him and wants to run back in and tell the other prisoners about freedom and what's outside and the reality of the world outside the cave. But what happens is that the other prisoners have become so complacent and so happy sitting in the cave watching these shadows. Maybe happy is the wrong word. Complacent watching these shadows. That they don't like this message. That there's a different world outside the cave, and that there's a different kind of reality or truth out there. And so as a consequence, they end up wanting to kill the prisoner, murder the guy who came back in to tell them because of how uncomfortable they are about all this. So the idea here, of course, is that we can make certain comparisons in this allegory. That's the beauty of an allegory, right? Is that it allows us, it takes a complicated idea and puts it in a story form so that we can apply it across a wide variety of theoretical scenarios. And of course, it gives us an idea about how we can think about media and how we exist today. So, we are all in some sense prisoners in a cave being shown a series of different images, right? The most obvious connection to all this, of course, would be the cinema, where we literally sit in the dark in a cave-like environment and we have this projector that shines images up on the screen that are remarkably similar to the kinds of shadows that Plato's prisoners observe. But on a different scale, we can look at all the different news channels, at all the different websites, at all these different media organizations that are providing us with our media artifacts that we consume, the films, the television shows, the streaming programs, the websites, the videos on TikTok and Instagram and all these things. We can look at this in the same way as Plato presents us with the cave. That there are media organizations that are showing us these shadows that we in some way mistake for reality. And that indeed, if we try and step outside of this imagined reality, what happens is that people instantly feel very uncomfortable. And it creates a cognitive dissonance that is very similar to what the prisoner experiences when he runs outside the cave for the first time and has to deal with the light. and realizing that there's more to the world than what he understands. Now, all of this, in some sense, fits very nicely with the kind of Marxist critique that we see, or neo-Marxist critique that we see coming out of Adorno and Horkheimer in their subsequent article. Now, Adorno and Horkheimer wrote their piece in the late 1940s, so you know, almost 2,000 years later, more than 2,000 years later. But nevertheless, it deals with the same sort of ideas, that being that there are people, a kind of ruling class, like these prison guards that are in charge, that give us the images that we see, and that they are not representative of reality. Indeed, in some sense, the idea is that these images kind of conspire to hide reality. So here we have Adorno and Horkheimer. This is Adorno, Theodor Adorno. This is Max Horkheimer. And they are members of what was called the Frankfurt School, which was an actual school in Frankfurt, Germany, that was founded, I believe, in the 1910s, and developed steadily through the 1920s and 30s, leading up to the 40s, where we saw, well, in late 1930 we saw Hitler's rise to power. In the 1940s, late 1930s, 1940s, many of these intellectuals had to leave, had to flee, because they were Jewish intellectuals, and of course being a Jewish intellectual in Nazi Germany was not a good thing. Right? So these guys were members of the Frankfurt School. If you click on this link, by the way, in my slides, you'll get some more information if you're interested. But they're members of the Frankfurt School, and they write this book that's called The Dialectic of Enlightenment. Now, they write this in a particular context. And the context comes with their experiences in World War II and what they see happen in their home country of Germany. Specifically, they see the death camps, they see the rise of the Nazis and the threat of fascist barbarism rise throughout all of Europe. And they look at this and they wonder, how did one of the world's greatest civilizations come to this? How did they create, with the Holocaust, the worst act of genocide ever in the history of mankind? And in other words, how did one of the greatest, most civilized country in the world become so barbaric? And so this is a question that they're trying to answer through some of their thinking. So what happens is that Adorno and Horkheimer, as they see the rise of Hitler, flee to Southern California. And they sit down and they write this book. And the general theory behind the book, the way that they explain what happens in Germany, is that the Enlightenment, this movement, the Age of Enlightenment, had turned into its opposite. So the Age of Enlightenment is a period of time in human history where we see a great emphasis put on rationality, on science, on logical reasoning. And so they look at this, and the Enlightenment, by the way, is generally considered the most important time in the history of Western civilization. It's why you're at college, right? You wouldn't be here without the Enlightenment. And the idea is that the Enlightenment has informed many of our greatest cultures and civilizations, including the United States. It was Enlightenment principles that inspired the founding fathers of the United States to write in the Constitution that all men are created equal, for example. That's an Enlightenment idea. So generally, throughout the course of Western civilization and within the context of the academy and higher learning, we have great respect for the Enlightenment, because it's the movement that brought us here today. But Adorno and Horkheimer want to push back against this. And so they write this book that say that the Enlightenment indeed created problems, and that the Enlightenment turned into its opposite, that democracy produced fascism, that reason produced unreason, and that the individuality that was encouraged through the Enlightenment had turned into a kind of conformity. Now, there is a fair amount of criticism surrounding Adorno and Horkheimer, particularly from people on the right wing, people who are very conservative, like to criticize the Frankfurt School thinkers, and Adorno and Horkheimer in particular, because these guys fled potential death at the hands of the Nazis and left their fascist regime and relocated in Southern California, which is, I mean, particularly during the late 1940s, one of the most beautiful places on earth. And so a lot of people criticize them as kind of, curmudgeons, kind of like the old guys on the Muppet Show, right? Statler and Waldorf. So there's a lot of criticism that they're just grumpy old men, but nevertheless, I think you'll see that they make some really interesting points as we move along. So again, the culture industry, Enlightenment is Mass Deception. The piece that I asked you to read is part of this book called The Dialectic of Enlightenment. And it was written in exile. Again, they fled Nazi Germany and relocated to California during the 30s and 40s. And during this time in California and in the United States more broadly, we see the rise of consumer society, which is people buying lots and lots of stuff and in some ways defining themselves through what they buy. They also see the rise of mass communications. In particular, they see the rise of television, as well as the movies sort of hit their apex, right? So they're witness to the cultural power of commercial broadcasting. They see how President Roosevelt uses the radio and radio broadcasts in order to rally Americans behind the war effort in World War II. They were also witness to how the Nazis utilized the radio to help their rise to power. They see that the movies are attracting between 85 million and 110 million Americans every week. So that's well over half of the American population, about 3/4 of the American population at the time, are attending the movies at least once a week, which is, these are wild numbers. Today, you might get 20 to 30 million people in a country that's double the size that it was in 1945. And at the same time, of course, this is the time of magazines, comic books, cheap fiction, pulp fiction, these kinds of things. And so they see people buying paperbacks and magazines and going to the movies and listening to the radio. And of course, all this leads up ultimately to television. Because they're in Southern California, they're also surrounded by friends and neighbors who are working in the film industry, so they see the power and the riches that are being created through the American film industry. And some of their compatriots and colleagues from Germany had relocated to Washington, D.C., and were working in the Office of War Information. Now, the Office of War Information was just America's propaganda wing. Propaganda is something that we oftentimes think of the enemy using, but we certainly utilize it here in the United States as well. So they're watching the influence of mass media on culture. They saw it in Germany, and they saw it in the United States. So, of course, they look to this hugely powerful mass media as a source of the problems that occurred in Germany. So what they do is they sit down and they theorize about all this, and they come up with this idea that the culture industry is something, let's say, that's new. In other words, it changes art. Now, we talked about this before with the Walter Benjamin Work of Art article. But what they're saying here is that the world of art and the production of cultural artifacts has changed. And that culture, quote unquote, has become an industry. So they view it, because they're Marxists, they're looking at this and they're saying, listen, capitalism has turned art into an industry. It's industrialized art. And we shouldn't talk about things like popular culture or mass culture, because there's nothing popular or mass about it. People aren't making these things, right? It's not the vast population that makes things popular. Instead, it's this industrial class of culture makers who are producing a product and putting it out to the people, forcing it, right? Forcing culture from above. So on page 8, they say they saw the culture industry as being administered culture, imposed from above as instruments of indoctrination and social control. So what they're getting at here is this sort of Marxist concept that the ideas of the ruling class, the people in charge of the mode of production, the people who are in charge of the factories and so on, that their ideas are the ruling ideas. And so they're saying, listen, what's happened is that there's an industrial culture now, that the film studios, for example, are dream factories, that they're churning out art as if it's a widget or a car or something, like on an assembly line. and that these things are used as instruments of social control. In other words, they help to perpetuate the system and the status quo, life as is. So if I'm rich and I own a movie studio, I'm going to make movies that have ideas and stories in them that help to support my position as a leader, as an elite, help keep the people that are down down, and at the same time feed them ideas so that they don't realize how bad they have it, and I can keep being rich and powerful. So that's what they mean by instruments of indoctrination and social control. So then, the culture industries for Adorno and Horkheimer are, quote, a central part of a new configuration of capitalist modernity, which use culture, advertising, mass comm, and new forms of social control to induce, consent to, and reproduce new forms of capitalist society. So this comes from page 8 as well. And again, the idea here is that I'm running the culture industry with my buddies. We're all cultural elites. We're all rich. We all want to stay rich. And so we're going to make these movies with messages that get people to agree with things the way they are. Because, of course, the idea behind Marx's communist revolution was that eventually what would happen is that the workers, all these people who were working so hard for all the rich folks, would eventually become dissatisfied with their lives and the conditions of their existence. They'd realize that in some sense they're being taken advantage of. And they'd rebel. They'd have a revolution. So Adorno and Horkheimer are saying that the culture industries, these industrial manufacturers of culture, are creating cultural products that keep people from realizing, that keep the workers from realizing how bad they have it, and keep the situation as it is, maintain the status quo. So again, more traditional Marxist critiques suggested the capitalist society radicalized the working class. So in other words, that Marxists believed eventually workers would rise up. But Adorno and Horkheimer said that what's going on is that the culture industries inhibit the development of class consciousness. So they keep people from realizing how bad they have it, and they do this by providing the ruling and political economic forces with an instrument of social control. So then, the question becomes, how do you think this instrument of control functions? Well, I have some ideas. So, for example, at NASCAR races, arguably NASCAR is not a sport of the rich, right? Maybe for the drivers and the people who participate in it, but the rest of them are usually lower class Americans, right? One of the ways that you maintain control, one of the ways that you support the status quo is by advertising the military, for example, right, to poor people who don't have a lot of other opportunities. So you go to the race, you see the Army race car, and you're like, oh yeah, hell yeah, I'm going to join the military. Yeah, America, right? And so this helps perpetuate the system, right? It prevents foreign enemies from messing with the status quo. It keeps poor people relatively poor. In some cases, they sacrifice their lives for their country. Right? We have people like Rush Limbaugh, who now, of course, is dead, but was a conservative radio pundit. He had the most popular radio show in America. And on there, he regularly preached these kinds of conservative ideas that were very appealing to generally to white, lower-class Americans, but helped the rich. Then we have programs like Say Yes to the Dress, right, where we have people spending enormous sums of money on wedding dresses, $30,000, $40,000 on wedding dresses, and making it seem as if the nuclear family with the wife and husband and 2 kids and a white picket fence and so on is the ideal, right? Perpetuating the same way of life over and over again and doing it through glamour, supporting the consumerism and the spending of huge quantities of cash on something that arguably you only have to spend a couple $100 on if you go to the city hall and get a marriage certificate. Programs like 1 Adam 12, which was a TV show when I was a kid that glorifies being a police officer, right? Programs like The Cosby Show that make it seem as if having one parent who's a doctor and one parent who is a lawyer and living in a multi-million-dollar brownstone in New York City is a viable and available kind of alternative, or something that in particular, African Americans during the 1980s could aspire to, and something that's within reach, right? If you just work hard enough, you can get these things, is the message here. Now, that may or may not be true. And Adorno and Horkheimer would probably argue, listen, that probably wasn't available to a lot of African Americans during the 1980s. That's really debatable. But the point is that shows like this give you the idea that it is possible. And so as a result, you might look at your life and say, okay, well, things are really bad for me right now, but if I work hard enough, they'll get better. And of course, if you're working really hard for someone else, who does that help the most? You or the person in power? Adorno and Horkheimer would argue that it's the person in power. Now, I should say at this point that I don't personally agree with Adorno and Horkheimer's views on a lot of this. I think it's much more complicated than the way they make it out to be. So I am somewhat resistant and happy to push back on Adorno and Horkheimer. But it's also important to recognize that you're reading this because it's one of the most important pieces of academic work related to mass media and communications in the history of mankind. This is part of the canon. This is part of what we read in communications. And if you went to graduate school, you'd read this thing in every class, probably. So some other examples might be something like This Is 40, the movie This Is 40, where the character turns 40 and has this nice BMW and this beautiful multi-million-dollar house in Brentwood, I think it is, in California. And again, the idea here is if you just work hard enough, you can have these things. And in particular, the idea is that when you hit 40, you should have these things. And I remember this because this movie came out when I turned 40 years old. And I went to the theater and sat there and thought to myself, well, where's my multi-million-dollar house in Brentwood? Am I doing it wrong? Should I be doing something different, right? So you see, these function through social comparison in some ways as a means of control, of thinking, oh, I need to work harder. And of course, if you aren't working for yourself, working harder benefits the people in charge. And this would be the argument of Adorno and Horkheimer. So what they're trying to do here, according to Douglas Kellner, who's another theorist who wrote about Adorno and Horkheimer, what they're trying to do here, he says, is that they utilize a model that pits the individual against its adversary, which is the power of capitalism. Kellner interprets Adorno and Horkheimer as trying to create a kind of individuality that flies in the face of the conformity that's necessitated by corporate capitalism. And this is echoed in statements like this one, where Adorno and Horkheimer say, the society we inhabit is not chaotic, but rather homogeneous, a system which is uniform and whole in every part. Mass culture bears out the absolute power of capitalism, an order that preaches individualism, and yet one in which all the living units crystallize into well-organized complexes. I realize this is hard to unpack, but what they're saying here is that we look at mass culture as chaotic, as being this weird mixture of all these different things, right? Like you don't think, you can think of Sylvester Stallone and The Expendables, and then think of like Megan Thee Stallion and say, well, what in the world do these people have to do with one another, right? Like they're in two different businesses. One makes music, one makes movies. They couldn't be more different in some ways. But what Adorno and Horkheimer is saying is, listen, don't let that fool you, because it's all part of one uniform system, and the system is industrial capitalism. And they go on and say, businessmen do not even need to mask their intentions. Movies and radio do not bother pretending they are art. They present themselves as business and call themselves industries. And of course, this is true. Right next door to the building my office is in is the Creative Media Industries Institute. I mean, these aren't people saying they're artists. They're people saying they're businessmen selling art. They go on and say the technology of the culture industry, its standardization and mass production does not serve the human order, but rather serves and sustains itself. So the business is there to support the business, not to make culture, not to make our lives better, but rather to support itself, to support, indeed, its constant growth. They go on and claim the culture industry is inextricably bound to the interests of capital, meaning money, right, and banks. So they say studios rely on banks. Mass culture may seem to offer a wide array of goods, but the choices depend more on classifying and labeling consumers rather than on subject matter. And then they give you this famous line, something is provided for all so that none may escape. The distinctions are emphasized and extended. So what they're saying here, these are all examples of what they're saying. So mass culture may seem to offer a wide array of goods, but the choices depend more on classifying, organizing, and labeling consumers. So what you have here then, with the examples I put down here at the bottom, this is all beer, right? Malt liquor, beer. It's all pretty much the same thing. But the way it's marketed classifies the consumers in this really interesting way, right? So they're selling beer, but it's not that there are all these different kinds of beer. The product's really all kind of the same. What's different is the consumer that they're appealing to, right? So if you are, a fan of Snoop Dogg and, you're into rap and this kind of thing, right? Then you have Blast from Colt 45. If you're like a really suave, if you fancy yourself a suave, cultured, kind of intellectual man of danger like James Bond, you drink Heineken. If you are Latin American and, are really into hot girls, here's your Miller Lite, right? If you're a redneck, then you're going to go fishing with your buddies, right? And drink Busch, head for the mountains, right? Of Busch. They even have beer for athletic, fit people. Right? But it's all just beer. What they're doing here is they're selling what is in essence the same thing. Oh, and if you're a girl and you like puppies and hot dudes, in roll-neck sweaters, we got beer for you too. But you see, in every instance, this is essentially the same product. What's being differentiated is the consumer. We make these models of consumers, not different models of beer. It's all really the same beer, but it's being sold in such a way where we classify, organize, and label our consumers rather than the product itself, right? So they go on, and of course they talk about radio and film and a little bit about TV. TV is still really getting started. But they say, for example, radio, as you might know, was the thing that was in everyone's home before TV was in everyone's home. And it had radio was composed of networks, much like TV was at one time. And so they say radio is at best a form of pseudo-choice. You can listen to programs that are basically all the same, and there's no mechanism of response. So in other words, you don't get to say what comes on the radio. You just have to listen to what comes on. Now, of course, this is, 60, 70 years before Spotify, right? So you have to just listen to what comes on. If you don't like it, too bad. So they go on, spontaneity and alternative possibility become monitored by talent scouts, ever eager to make certain no important voice remains outside the industry. So what they're saying here is that if there is talent out there, if there are singers or musicians or whatever, that the industry is going to go grab them, suck them in, and make them part of this industry. From there, we move on to TV. Soon, the coming of television, the thinly veiled identity of all industrial cultural products, can come triumphantly out of the open. A parodic fulfillment of the Wagnerian Gesamtkunstwerk, the fusion of all artworks in one, the absolute triumph of invested capital. So what they're saying is TV, they're predicting that television will be sort of the ultimate expression of this manipulative culture industry. And it'll be the ultimate production because it'll be broadcast in your homes, everybody will have one, it'll combine sound and images, and it'll be pervasive. And they'll be able to make these programs that are sort of the ultimate weapons in the war of social control. Now, they didn't like the movies either. So they say real life is becoming indistinguishable from the movies. The sound film, far surpassing the theater of illusion, leaves no room for imagination or reflection on the part of the audience. So what they're complaining about here, of course, is, sort of goes back to the idea of people complaining about film in relationship to reading. You read a book, you have to imagine what's going on. It's sort of a theater of the mind. You go to the movies, there's no room for interpretation. There's no room for imagining as you might with with a book. And so what happens then is they say that the film forces its victims to equate it directly with reality. In other words, people go to the movies, they see this thing, and even though they understand that the film isn't real, they still equate it with reality, right? And we see this all the time. There are lots of audience studies, particularly with television, where we see that people sort of confuse the characters actors play with the actors themselves and so on. We don't think we do that, but we do. And we'll talk more about that in later units. They go on and say that cinema breeds full-blown illusionism. It offers spectacle we mistake for reality. And that the spectacle, right, the dream that film presents us with, are dreams of an ideologically determined dream factory. And that we imagine these dreams are our own, but they're really stories that support the elites and the capitalist system that's in place. They go on then to say that all the explosions, the special effects, all the stuff that we see in films today, and they blame sound, right, because they're writing about 10 years after sound films really become a thing, 20 years after films become a thing. They say that sound films demand the spectator's quickness and visual attention, however, sustained thought is not possible if one wants to keep up with the continuing flow of the sounds and images. So an example of all this, right, of mistaking the ideological dreams of the dream factory for our own might be something like Batman. So with Batman, what we have, of course, is Bruce Wayne, who is a billionaire white patriarch, is the hero who, through sheer will, turns himself into a kind of Nietzschean Superman and is able to save the world from villains like Bane, who is, of course, a Marxist, right? I mean, in this speech, which I'm not going to show you for the sake of time, but if you watch it, you'll see what Bane is preaching in this Batman movie is communism. He wants to free the oppressed. He wants to go to the rich sections of Gotham City, tear the rich from their $1 million apartments, and take their shit. This is Marxism in its purest form. And who saves the day? The rich, white, billionaire, capitalist male. So it's an ideological dream that supports the idea that rich people are not just good, they're the saviors of society, right? And that in particular, these kinds of folks are the saviors of society. We see the same thing more recently in movies like Iron Man, where we have another rich billionaire white dude, and this time an arms dealer, a manufacturer of weapons of death, saves the world, as in this clip, where he flies into the Middle East and sets everything straight for these poor savage people from a uncivilized culture, quote unquote. Right? I mean, this is an ideological message. This is one that says that the rich capitalist is the savior not just of Gotham City, but the world. Right? And that this patriarchal white capitalist system is the best. Not only is it the best, it's the only system that can save everything, right? And this is, of course, to be clear, this is, of course, what Adorno and Horkheimer are criticizing. So they go on then, and they talk about how this whole section is about how this culture industry consumes difference. So it says, they're really aware of style. And so what we see is that there is a kind of sameness, to the products of the culture industry, particularly Hollywood. So, there are standard forms of film editing, for example, shot, reverse shot, the long shot, match on action, graphic match, right? There are all these ways that we make movies that are used in every film that's made. At the same time, there's also, of course, a 3-act structure to every film that's made. If you're writing a screenplay, it should be 90 pages long. Each page equals 1 minute of screen time, right? I mean, there's this they're all the same in this way. And so Adorno and Horkheimer are criticizing this sameness. We think there are all these different products, that we can go see all these different movies, but they're all put together the same way. And if somebody steps out of line, like Orson Welles when he made Citizen Kane, and puts together a film using deep focus, right, with Greg Toland as a cinematographer, if he does something like this, if he changes the way that films are made, what happens is the system just eats them up, assimilates them, takes their new style, incorporates it into the industrial capitalist playbook, and keeps rolling, right? So as a result, what happens is the culture industry products are all the same, right? They're all the same. And they represent a kind of industrial capitalism. If anybody steps out of line, then they grab what they're doing, right, and assimilate it, make it part of this sameness. And so what they're saying is what happens, and again, they're writing this when most people are working in factories. Then what they say is, by subordinating in the same way and to the same end all areas of intellectual creation, so all the artwork, by occupying men's senses from the time they leave the factory in the evening to the time they clock in again the next morning, with matter that bears the impress of the labor process they themselves have sustained throughout the day, this subsumption mockingly satisfies the concept of a unified culture, which the philosophers of personality contrasted with mass culture. So what they're saying here, right, is that you work in a factory all day, you check out, you go watch a movie that's made in the same factory style and supports the same factory industrial capitalist mentality. You're just embedded in this way of thinking from the time you wake up until the next day. And so then, what happens if somebody's really nonconformist? What happens if they can't assimilate an artist's style? Well, according to Adorno and Horkheimer, it just ignores them, right? So they say the only way to resist is to fit in or make one's peculiar brand of deviation part of the system, right? So you can't even play if you're really different. No one can really be outspoken, right? And so one is free not to conform, but in doing so, to remain powerless, both economically and intellectually. So what they're saying is, if there was a really radical filmmaker out there that the system couldn't co-opt, that they would just ignore them, and eventually they become unimportant. One thinks about, Rich Men North of Richmond, right? The song from, what was the guy's name? Anthony Oliver, I think. Right? That guy came out, had this song that was viral, got 1 billion downloads or whatever, and all the record companies went to the guy and wanted to sign him to a contract and make him a star. He said no. What have you heard from the guy since? Well, nothing, right? Now, if he'd signed these contracts, he'd have an album out, there'd be videos, you'd be watching him on YouTube, but he didn't. And so what's happened? It seems that he's being ignored, right? They go on and say, in today's society, the myth of success exercises a particularly powerful influence. So here the idea, of course, is that success is really kind of a myth, but it's one that we buy into because we want to, right? And it disguises our current situation. We can look at where we're at, look at how crappy our houses or apartments are, how crappy our cars are, but say, listen, if I work hard enough, I can still succeed. So you're not even thinking about where you're at now. You're forever facing the future and never thinking about the moment, the now. So, again, I'm going to emphasize this idea of sameness that they have, Adorno and Horkheimer, where they say a persistent sameness governs mass culture. It is not new, rather it constantly recycles the past. And of course we can see that with the films that are being made in Hollywood, for example, The Great Gatsby. So if you were to say, have you seen The Great Gatsby, my question would be, which one? The one from 2013, the one from 1974, the one from 2000, the one from 1926, the one from 1949. You see, we just keep telling the same stories over and over and over again. It isn't just a matter of sameness with regard to the way they're edited and the way that the scripts are put together. We're literally making the same thing again and again. We're doing the same thing with sequels. right? There's no newness. So again, there's a stylistic kind of sameness with editing and cinematography, but there's also kind of formal sameness with narrative construction, with the 3 acts, right? We have a sameness with the shot, reverse shot editing, with editing like the establishing shot, seen here from Seinfeld. But there's also an editing in how, or a sameness in the composition of the stories and how they're put together. So a formal and aesthetic similarity that they're complaining about. So what you get out of this then is a bunch of fantasy wear, what they call fantasy wear, that circulates throughout society. And it's not serious art, right? Indeed, what happens is that the culture industry brings together serious art and light art, as well as art and distraction. You know, art at one time was the province of the rich, of the nobility, of the church. But what happens with industrial capitalism is it becomes available to everyone, which we might view as an egalitarian kind of good thing, or we might view as the dumbing down of art for the masses, which is clearly how Adorno and Horkheimer think of it. At the same time, amusement, you know, what we're supposed to get through the culture industry, becomes business, right? Amusement is a serious business. And in some sense, it's only another form of work. You know, we try and get out of the factories, get out of the mechanized work process, to get the strength to go in and do it all again the next day. But what we're really doing is just supporting that industry and being a part of it. And this is particularly true when it comes to things like social media, with Twitter, with Instagram, with TikTok. I mean, the content that you make, if you're having fun, if your amusement is making Instagram posts or TikTok posts, you know, what you're doing is making content for Mark Zuckerberg and making him even richer. You're working when you're enjoying yourself. If you didn't make content for Instagram, Instagram would fold tomorrow. So even your leisure, even your amusement is a kind of work. Even when you're having fun and relaxing, you're part of the capitalist system and you're making the cultural and economic elites even more elite. So he says what we get, right, these promises that are made to us by the culture industry, all this spectacle, right, all the promise is illusory, that what it's selling we'll never actually get. There's no consummation, right? No seduction scene, no matter how steamy, fails to make it clear that we will never see sex consummated, precisely because it must never take place. But nevertheless, everything centers on copulation. So what they're saying is, you know, you see these images, you see this success, you see all this stuff on the screen, you see this is 40, and you see the $1 million house in Brentwood and the BMW, and what that is something that you'll never really achieve. But it's in the trying to achieve it, right? Even though you'll never consummate the sexual act of achieving these things, you know, you'll keep working towards it, right? And that's what it's all about. That's what keeps the system going. Indeed, you can never get it to some extent, because if you get it, you won't work as hard, and the system won't keep perpetuating itself. You can see how cynical all this is, right? And this, of course, is the problem with a lot of this Marxist and neo-Marxist theory, is that it's really cynical. But it doesn't make it less important. They go on, they attack comedy, laughter as being a kind of schadenfreude, right? Fun is therapy, a treatment the culture industry constantly prescribes. Laughter is a crucial instrument of the fraud practiced on the human desire for happiness. So even comedy, right? Even fun is a crime, according to Adorno and Horkheimer. It's all dedicated to the pleasure of being ready for anything at the expense of everyone else. Again, wildly cynical. So ultimately then they say amusement works together with business and aims to affirm the status quo, to make the people smile and say yes to the world. It creates a sense of pleasure devoid of thought or reflection, so people aren't thinking critically, lacking any oppositional or resistant energy, and indeed the liberation which amusement promises is freedom from thought and freedom from negation. So what's happening is then they're saying that, we're all entertained all the time and none of us are really sitting down or thinking. Movies emphasize chance, right? The idea that, chance is the flip side of planning, but it serves the real planners as an excuse, right? That we might get lucky. It reduces us to, this culture industry reduces us to objects. The culture industry, capitalism, industrial capitalism is only interested in us as consumers and employees, not as people. We're just objects. We're consumers, people who can buy things, and people who can make things. And so we're simply objects of manipulation, right? And as such, we have to become part of the system. We can't be an outsider, right? And to be part of the system, you have to be happy. You have to have a happy face and a cheerful countenance. You have to say yes to the system, right? But they say behind that happy face is a threat. Conform or suffer. So you have to go to work, you have to be happy about it, you have to be cheerful, you have to be friendly, and of course all this goes with the idea of emotional labor, where now a lot of jobs require us to be happy and pretend to be happy when we interact with customers, right? But there's a clear message there, which is act happy or you're going to get canned, right? Or you're going to be left out. And so he says, what happens, what Adorno and Horkheimer say is that all this leads us to this kind of, Lego world, everything is awesome kind of attitude.
Always use a turn signal. Park between the lines. Yes. Drop off dry cleaning before noon. Read the headlines. Don't forget to smile. Always root for the local sports team. Go sports team! Always return a compliment. Hey, you look nice. So do you. Drink overpriced coffee. There you go. That's $37. Awesome. Everything is awesome. Did you see where are my pants last night? Classic episode. Everything is awesome. Instructions coming in from Central. Okay, it says here, take everything weird and blow it up. All right, Silverhead. I make it look exactly like it does in the instructions. Hey, buddy, I need a 1x2 keyhole. No problem, Michael.
So you can only imagine how Adorno and Horkheimer would have reacted to something like everything is awesome from the Lego movie. This is, of course, tongue-in-cheek, but nevertheless represents exactly the kind of what they think is happening with regard to the culture industry and industrial capitalism. All right, that's it for Plato and Adorno and Horkheimer. Thanks for checking out my video. We'll get to another one next week.